On a cold night 9,000 feet up in the Peruvian Andes, someone spreads potatoes across open ground and walks away. By morning they're frozen solid. By midday thawed. Then bare feet press down and walk them flat, squeezing the water out through broken skin, and the whole cycle repeats for days until what's left barely looks like a potato anymore. A hard, gray, weightless disk that keeps for years without rot, without refrigeration, without anything but altitude and patience. That's a real preservation technology, invented long before anyone had a word for freeze-drying. It's also one small piece of a much bigger story, because the same plant that grew into that disk went on, for 1,000 miles and 2 centuries away, to feed an empire's population boom and then starve a nation. Same tuber. 2 entirely different endings. This is how one plant did both. Start where the potato actually comes from, because almost nobody guesses right. The potato is not European. It was never Irish first. It was domesticated somewhere in the highlands around Lake Titicaca, on the border of what's now Peru and Bolivia, from a wild tuber-bearing plant in the Solanum brevicale group, sometime between roughly 10,000 and 7,000 years ago. For decades, botanists argued over whether it happened once or many times across the Andes. A genetic study in 2005, tracing the DNA of hundreds of wild and cultivated potato varieties back to their source, settled it: one domestication, one place, one population of Andean farmers who turned a wild highland tuber into food. What those farmers did next is the part that matters later. They didn't grow one kind of potato. Andean communities bred the plant into thousands of distinct local varieties, different colors, different shapes, different tolerances for frost and drought and altitude, many of them found nowhere outside a single valley. Walk through a highland market today and you can still find dozens of those varieties piled in one stall, colors most European eyes have never been trained to expect from a potato. Farmers also planted across multiple elevation zones at once, a deliberate strategy anthropologists call vertical archipelago agriculture. Hedge the harvest by spreading it across many microclimates rather than betting on one. Hold on to that idea. It's going to explain something terrible for centuries and one ocean away. The potato left the Andes in the 1530s, riding along with the Spanish conquest of the Inca. Europe did not welcome it. The potato is a nightshade, the same family as deadly nightshade and henbane, and for roughly 200 years after it landed in Spain and then England, most of Europe treated it like one. Pull one out of the ground even now and it's not hard to see why the suspicion took hold. Gnarled, eyeless, grown in the dark underground, nothing about it looks like the grain and fruit Europeans already trusted as food. Its early cultivars really did carry more of the toxic compound solanine than modern potatoes do, so the occasional rash or upset stomach wasn't imagined, it was just misattributed to the whole plant instead of unripe skins. The same lumpy shape fed rumors that it caused leprosy. In France, the suspicion went all the way to law. In 1748, the Parliament of Paris formally banned growing potatoes, on the official grounds that they were believed to cause the disease. For those 2 centuries, the plant mostly fed livestock, sat in botanical gardens as a curiosity, or got planted only when a grain harvest failed and there was nothing else to eat. Not a staple. An emergency. The person credited with changing that reputation almost single-handedly is a French army pharmacist who learned to love the potato as a prisoner of war. Antoine-Augustin Parmentier survived on little else while held captive during the 7 Years' War, and he came home convinced the crop that kept him alive could feed all of France. He wrote pamphlets. He won an essay prize for a treatise on using the potato against famine. He hosted dinners for Paris's most fashionable guests, potato in every course, and by some accounts pinned potato flowers to the coats of the French court, turning the plant into a Versailles fashion statement. Whether or not that guarded field ever needed guarding, the timeline around it says something on its own. Paris had quietly lifted its potato ban back in 1772, more than a decade before Parmentier's campaign hit full stride, so official permission and genuine cultural acceptance moved on two entirely different clocks. What actually closed the gap was a real grain shortage in 1785. A famine scare that forced emergency potato planting across northern France and gave ordinary families their first hands-on experience of the crop as a hedge against hunger, not a curiosity for the wealthy. France flirted with the potato. Ireland built its whole food system on top of it, and that decision came with a hidden cost nobody could see yet. By the early 1800s, Irish land was concentrated under a small number of landlords, many of them absentee, leasing down through middlemen to tenant farmers holding smaller and smaller plots. At the bottom of that ladder sat the cottiers, families working land you could cross in a few dozen strides, a fraction of an acre and no more. The potato was the only crop that could feed a family on that little ground, because it produces more calories per acre than the grain crops it replaced. Historians estimate that by the 1840s, close to 3 million people, roughly a third of Ireland, depended on the potato as virtually their only food for large stretches of the year. Zoom out, and the potato was doing something far bigger than feeding cottiers. Economists comparing regions across the Old World that could and couldn't grow the crop have credited its arrival with roughly a quarter of all the population and urban growth Europe saw between 1700 and 1900, a genuine engine behind the population booms that led a handful of nations' project power across the globe in that same window. Ireland ran that engine harder than almost anywhere else, on a narrower genetic base than almost anywhere else. Both halves of that sentence are about to matter at once. In 1845, something arrived that a genetically uniform crop had no way to stop. Phytophthora infestans, potato late blight, is believed to have crossed the Atlantic from the Americas, first confirmed near Philadelphia in 1843. By 1845 it had reached Belgium, and within that same growing season it swept through the Netherlands, Germany, France, and across the Irish Sea. A field can turn from green to black within a week once the spores take hold, fast enough that people watched it happen day by day and could do nothing to stop it. Continental Europe had blight too. Continental Europe, for the most part, also had other food to fall back on. Ireland's rural poor mostly didn't. The famine that followed, and Gortamore, killed roughly 1 million people out of a population of about 8.5 million, and pushed 1 to 2 million more into emigration, numbers historians describe as informed estimates rather than exact counts, since Ireland had no comprehensive death registry at the time to count against. Disease, typhus, dysentery, cholera, spreading through overcrowded workhouses and relief lines, killed more of them than starvation did in the strictest sense. And through most of those years, Ireland kept exporting grain and livestock to Britain, some of it under armed guard, while people starved in the surrounding countryside. O'Grada has spent a career studying this famine more closely than almost anyone alive, and that's his verdict, not a softened one, and not this channel's. His research also draws a hard line on one specific word. He finds no evidence of a deliberate policy to kill, so by the strict definition, not genocide. In his own accounting, the staggering, documented failure was policy, not intent, and it still shapes an island's population count today. Here's the question that connects everything back to that frozen field in the Andes. The potato's own birthplace never had a famine like this one. Why not? Not because Andean farmers had some wisdom Europe forgot. Because of arithmetic. The Andes still hold something like 4,000 distinct native potato varieties, spread across altitude zones the way Chapter 1 described, a plant population with enormous genetic variety built into it. What crossed the Atlantic to Europe and then narrowed further into Ireland's single lumper clone was a sliver of that diversity, and then a sliver of a sliver. That lesson wasn't lost on the people who study crop genetics for a living. The world's largest collection of potato diversity now lives in a seed bank in Lima, at the International Potato Center, and since the late 1990s it has been running the process in reverse, sending thousands of preserved Andean landrace samples back out to the highland communities that grew them originally, deliberately rebuilding the exact genetic depth the narrow, uniform harvest once proved couldn't be spared. That frozen field at 9,000 feet is still out there. Somebody is still spreading potatoes across the ground tonight, still trampling them by hand tomorrow, working with a genetic diversity that never let one bad season become a national catastrophe. An ocean away, a single stolen field outside Paris and a single cloned variety in Ireland tell the other half of the story, how the same plant that helped double a continent's population also, through no fault of the tuber itself, left a country with nothing left to fall back on. So the next time there's a bag of identical potatoes on the counter, it's worth asking, what's the modern version of the lumper? The one thing in your own life that's gotten too uniform to survive a bad year?